Tonight we embark on a journey into something brutal, something that cinema has romanticized, video games have glorified, and nearly everyone who believes they understand the Crusades has fundamentally misunderstood. We are delving into one of history's most savage, tumultuous, and utterly wretched epochs, a period where religious zeal, political aspiration, and sheer desperation converged in the arid landscapes of the Holy Land and the gore-soaked streets of Jerusalem. So, before you settle in, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely appreciate the content I produce. I also encourage you to share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your location. It is always fascinating to discover our global audience. Now, dim the lights, adjust your comfort, and allow the world to recede. Let us ease into tonight's narrative together. Visualize this scene. It is the year 1096. You are a humble peasant farmer in France, struggling to subsist when a priest arrives in your village bearing news that alters everything. Pope Urban II has proclaimed a holy war. He promises that anyone who embraces the cross and journeys to Jerusalem will be granted complete absolution for all their transgressions. Complete forgiveness. Every falsehood, every act of theft, every moment of weakness eradicated. And if you perish during the expedition, instant passage into paradise is assured. It sounds too advantageous to be true. And indeed, it is. Because what the priest omits, what he is incapable of fully conveying in his fervent sermon, is the grim reality that awaits you on this pilgrimage. The gnawing hunger, the rampant diseases, the oppressive heat that transforms your armor into a furnace, slowly incinerating you. The unseen arrows, the debilitating dysentery that claims more Crusaders than any Muslim force ever will. The betrayals, the pervasive confusion, the sheer pandemonium of attempting to wage war 3,000 miles from home, in an unfamiliar land, against adversaries intimately acquainted with every rock, every ravine, every concealed ambush. You are unaware of any of this. All you perceive is the offer of salvation. And in the medieval era, where existence is brief, savage, and overshadowed by the perpetual dread of eternal damnation, that is a proposition too compelling to decline. Thus, you embrace the cross. You affix it to your tunic. You bid farewell to your family, likely for the final time, though this you do not yet comprehend. And you commence your eastward trek toward Jerusalem, toward glory, toward what you believe will be your spiritual redemption. Your actual destination is a nightmare that will compel you to question all your convictions about divinity, about warfare, and about the possibility of ever returning home. Let us rewind to the genesis of it all. It is November 27, 1095, at the Council of Clermont in France. Pope Urban II stands before an immense assembly. He delivers an address of profound historical consequence, a speech that would instigate 2 centuries of conflict, reshape the geopolitical fabric of Europe and the Middle East, and ultimately lead hundreds of thousands to their demise. Urban's message is both concise and potent. The Holy Land, the sacred birthplace of Christ, is under the dominion of Muslims. Christian pilgrims undertaking journeys to Jerusalem are subjected to harassment, assault, and murder. The Byzantine Empire, the last bulwark of Christendom in the East, is besieged by the Seljuk Turks and urgently requires assistance. It is time for the valiant warriors of Christianity to cease their internal strife and unite against a common adversary. However, Urban does not solely rely on religious obligation. His wisdom runs deeper. He understands his audience. These are knights, nobles, and commoners inhabiting a world rife with perpetual warfare, where aggression serves as the primary method of dispute resolution. Consequently, he presents them with something they comprehend: a holy war, wherein the act of killing is not merely permissible, but actively encouraged. It is righteous. It is divine will. And then, the ultimate enticement, the promise of indulgence. Engage in this conflict, and all your sins will be forgiven. Perish in this war, and your place in heaven is irrevocably secured. For medieval Christians, living in constant apprehension of hell, regularly confessing their sins yet still fearing their inadequacy, this represents the ultimate liberation from eternal retribution. The crowd erupts in enthusiasm. Shouts of Deus vult, God wills it, resound. Garments are torn to fashion crosses. Vows are made on the spot to join the crusade. Urban has tapped into something primal, a potent blend of spiritual fervor, martial pride, and the allure of ultimate salvation, an intoxicating combination. But here is a crucial point often overlooked regarding the First Crusade. It was not a single, coordinated military undertaking. Instead, it comprised multiple waves of individuals from diverse regions, each with distinct leaders, varied motivations, and wildly unequal levels of preparation. The initial wave, known as the People's Crusade, was spearheaded by a captivating preacher named Peter the Hermit. Peter possessed no military acumen, no strategic mastery. He was merely a fervent believer who convinced thousands of peasants, the impoverished, and hangers-on to embark immediately for Jerusalem. This endeavor lacked training, provisions, or any plan beyond proceeding eastward in faith. It was a catastrophe waiting to unfold, and it did so swiftly. The People's Crusade departed in the spring of 1096, months before the officially sanctioned military expedition was slated to commence. As they journeyed through Germany, they began to enact their crusading zeal by attacking Jewish communities. Their warped reasoning was simple. Why postpone the confrontation with non-Christians until reaching the Holy Land when such individuals were readily available at home? The massacres in the Rhineland were horrific. Entire Jewish settlements were annihilated. Men, women, and children were indiscriminate victims. The Crusaders perceived themselves as holy warriors, and any non-Christian was deemed a legitimate target. This was not an anomaly, but the unvarnished, brutal manifestation of the crusading spirit. Upon their arrival in Constantinople, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I surveyed this motley assembly and recognized their impending doom. He implored them to await the arrival of professional armies. However, Peter's followers were impatient. They crossed into Anatolia, entering Seljuk territory, and were promptly decimated. The Turks ambushed them near a location called Siveto. It was less a battle and more a massacre. Thousands of Crusaders perished. The survivors were reduced to slavery. Peter the Hermit, ironically, survived by returning to Constantinople to solicit provisions. His crusade had effectively concluded before it had truly begun. Nevertheless, the principal crusade, led by actual military commanders and substantial armies, was just commencing. And if you deem the People's Crusade calamitous, you have yet to witness the true extent of the devastation. The primary crusading force was segmented into several armies, each under the command of a different nobleman. Among them were Raymond of Toulouse, one of Europe's most affluent individuals; Godfrey of Bouillon, a duke from Lorraine who would attain legendary status; Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman adventurer driven by personal enrichment as much as religious conviction; and several others, each with their own contingent of soldiers, their own supplies, and their own private ambitions. This fragmentation immediately engendered significant challenges. There was no unified command structure, no singular leader empowered to make decisions for the entire crusade. Every critical decision necessitated intricate negotiations among these proud, ambitious nobles who harbored mutual distrust and certainly had no inclination to defer to one another. Then there was the Byzantine emperor. Alexios had solicited aid, but his expectation was a few thousand controllable mercenaries. What he received was tens of thousands of armed foreigners traversing his territory, consuming his resources, and issuing demands. He lived in fear that these crusaders might divert their attention towards conquering Constantinople rather than proceeding to Jerusalem. Consequently, Alexios compelled each crusading leader to swear an oath. Any territory they might capture that had formerly belonged to the Byzantine Empire would be returned to his authority. While seemingly reasonable, this act sowed the seeds of discord that would mar relations between the Crusaders and the Byzantines for the subsequent 2 centuries. Now, For an ordinary soldier within these crusading armies, such political intricacies hold little relevance. Oaths and territorial claims are inconsequential. Your concerns revolve around sustenance, potable water, and survival. And all three of these elements are on the cusp of becoming critical issues. The journey from Europe to the Holy Land spanned approximately 3,000 miles. 3,000 miles traversing unfamiliar landscapes, amid hostile populations, and through terrain varying from mountains to deserts. There were no established supply lines, no logistical infrastructure, no means of acquiring provisions other than by purchasing them from local inhabitants, foraging, or pilfering. And you undertook all of this while clad in armor. Not the plate armor depicted in films, which emerged much later, but chainmail, which remains extraordinarily heavy, 40 to 50 pounds of metal rings worn under the Mediterranean sun. Incorporate a helmet, a shield, a sword, and any personal effects you could carry, and you were burdened with nearly 70 pounds of equipment. Now attempt to march 20 miles daily under the oppressive heat with limited water, all while endeavoring to evade ambushes, enduring the ravages of dysentery, which would afflict nearly everyone at some juncture, and witnessing companions succumb to heat stroke, dehydration, or sheer exhaustion. This was the unvarnished reality of crusading, not the heroic charges and valorous battles, but a relentless, agonizing trudge through inhospitable territory, where disease and privation claimed far more lives than direct combat ever would. And you had not yet even reached the Holy Land. You were still in Anatolia, still hundreds of miles from Jerusalem, and already people were perishing. Already the crusade was beginning to appear as a grave miscalculation. Yet retreat was not an option. You had taken a sacred vow. You had affixed a cross to your attire. To abandon the crusade would constitute a sin, potentially more grievous than the very transgressions you sought to expiate in the first place. You persevere, enduring hardship and clinging to the hope that your sacrifices will ultimately prove worthwhile. This, however, is a false hope, though its truth remains hidden from you for now. The initial significant trial for the crusade occurred at Nicaea, a city in Anatolia previously seized by the Seljuk Turks from the Byzantines. This engagement was intended to be the crucible where the Crusaders would demonstrate their mettle, proving their capability as a formidable military force able to conquer fortified urban centers. The siege commenced in May of 1997. The Crusaders encircled the city, severing its supply lines and preparing for an extended campaign. Yet, they soon encountered a significant impediment: the absence of siege weaponry, including catapults, siege towers, and battering rams. Having journeyed all the way from Europe, they had neglected to bring the essential implements required for the actual capture of a fortified city. Consequently, they were compelled to construct all necessary equipment from rudimentary materials within enemy territory, all while the Turkish defenders observed from within the city walls, occasionally launching sorties to assault the Crusader encampments. This laborious and perilous undertaking afforded ample time for introspection, prompting questions about the wisdom of embarking on this crusade. The heat was oppressive. It was Anatolia in the summer, with temperatures frequently exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Remember, you were clad in chainmail, metal that absorbs heat, transforming your body into a slow-cooking furnace. Men succumbed to heat stroke, with some perishing from its effects. Water was scarce, forcing the Crusaders to depend on a limited number of wells and whatever water could be sourced from nearby streams. However, with tens of thousands of individuals encamped around the city, these sources were rapidly depleted. People drank water that was little more than mud, and dysentery spread through the camps with alarming speed. The food situation further exacerbated their plight. The Crusaders had brought some provisions, but far from sufficient for a prolonged siege. They were forced to forage in the surrounding countryside, necessitating the dispatch of armed parties highly vulnerable to Turkish ambushes. Many of these foraging expeditions never returned. The siege dragged on for weeks. The Crusaders constructed their siege engines and commenced bombarding the city walls. However, the Turks, well supplied and strongly entrenched, showed no inclination to surrender to this motley assembly of foreign soldiers. What ultimately resolved the siege was not Crusader military might, but Byzantine intervention. Emperor Alexios dispatched a fleet to Lake Ascanius, which bordered the city. The Byzantines gained control of the lake, thereby cutting off the city's water supply and rendering the Turkish position untenable. The garrison negotiated a surrender, but they capitulated to the Byzantines, not the Crusaders. This outcome intensely angered the Crusader leaders. They had borne the brunt of the effort and suffered the casualties, only for the Byzantines to receive the credit for capturing the city. This event marked the first significant rift in the alliance between the Crusaders and Byzantium, and it would certainly not be the last. Nevertheless, there was no leisure for dwelling on political grievances. The crusade had to advance. Jerusalem remained more than 1,000 miles distant, and the summer heat was transforming the landscape into a furnace. The subsequent major obstacle was the arduous transit across Anatolia itself. This was Seljuk territory, and the Turks harbored no intention of permitting a Crusader army to traverse their lands unhindered. They employed tactics entirely unfamiliar to the Europeans: swift hit-and-run assaults, mounted archers who would swiftly discharge volleys of arrows and retreat before the Crusaders could retaliate, and ambushes concealed within narrow mountain passes. The Crusaders were accustomed to engaging other European knights in combat, heavily armored cavalry charging at one another, culminating in close quarters fighting. However, the Turks did not engage in such warfare. Their approach was characterized by mobility, flexibility, and an intimate knowledge of the terrain. They could harass the Crusader column for hours, inflicting casualties without ever committing to a full-scale battle. This strategy constituted psychological warfare as much as physical confrontation. The Crusaders lived in constant uncertainty regarding the timing of the next attack, necessitating perpetual vigilance, which in turn prevented adequate rest. Exhaustion became a weapon as lethal as any sword. Then came the Battle of Dorylaeum on the 1st day of July in 1097. The Crusader army was divided into two contingents, marching a day apart. The Turks perceived this as an opportune moment and launched a fierce assault on the first group with overwhelming force, tens of thousands of mounted archers encircling the Crusader camp. The Crusaders formed a defensive perimeter, utilizing their wagons as makeshift fortifications. However, they were significantly outnumbered and sustaining heavy losses. Arrows fell like a deluge, men perished, and horses panicked. It seemed the crusade was destined to conclude then and there, in a dusty valley in the heart of Anatolia. Yet, at that critical juncture, the Second Crusader army arrived. Having heard the sounds of battle, they force-marched to the aid of their comrades. They struck the Turkish forces from the rear, catching them by surprise. The Turks, who had believed victory was within their grasp, suddenly found themselves trapped between two Crusader armies. The battle devolved into a rout. The Turks fled, abandoning their camp and supplies. The Crusaders emerged victorious, but at a devastating cost. Thousands of men lay dead or wounded. The survivors were profoundly traumatized by the ferocity of the fighting and the stark realization of how narrowly they had escaped total annihilation. And this was merely one engagement. Many more battles lay ahead, countless more days of marching through hostile territory. Innumerable nights spent wondering if one would awaken to the sound of Turkish war cries, and numerous moments of sheer terror when the chilling realization dawned that one was thousands of miles from home, surrounded by enemies, with no escape route but forward. The Crusaders pressed onward, for they had no alternative. To retreat would necessitate traversing the same hostile terrain once more, and they had already depleted most of the available resources along their established route. Their sole means of survival lay in continuing their advance toward Jerusalem, with the hope that upon reaching their destination, they could establish a secure foothold. However, the journey was exacting a severe toll. Men deserted the ranks. Some simply vanished into the night, preferring to risk their fate alone rather than continue with the army. Others succumbed to illness, to infected wounds, or to sheer exhaustion. The Crusader army that had departed Europe was dwindling with each passing mile. The most disheartening aspect was that they were still within Anatolia, having not yet reached Syria, let alone the Holy Land. The authentic crusade, the true conflict, still lay before them. If one had been a crusader at this stage, every aspect of the endeavor would have been subject to intense scrutiny. Why had one embarked on this journey? Was the promise of salvation truly worth such suffering? Would one even survive long enough to witness Jerusalem? These were not abstract ponderings. They were the intrusive thoughts that plagued sleepless nights, spent lying on the hard ground, listening to the moans of the wounded, and contemplating whether the next day would be the one for joining them. By the time the Crusaders arrived in Syria, they had been marching for over a year characterized by relentless hardship, constant peril, and continuous loss of life. They had lost thousands of men, and the survivors had become hardened, desperate, and increasingly brutal. The first major city they encountered in Syria was Antioch, and Antioch would prove to be the Crusaders' most formidable challenge. A siege that would persist for 8 grueling months and push them to the very precipice of collapse. Antioch stood as one of the region's most strategically important cities, boasting immense walls, robust fortifications, and a substantial garrison. The Crusaders arrived in October of 1097 and immediately recognized a critical problem. The city's vast perimeter was too extensive to be completely encircled by their forces. They lacked sufficient manpower to seal off all of its gates, which meant the defenders could provision and reinforce themselves while the Crusaders endured a slow starvation outside the walls. And starve they did. The surrounding countryside had already been thoroughly depleted by preceding armies, leaving no resources for foraging. The Crusaders were compelled to dispatch expeditions ever farther afield in search of sustenance. These missions were fraught with danger, as Turkish forces relentlessly harassed them, isolating stragglers and ambushing supply convoys. Winter arrived, accompanied by relentless rain. The Crusader encampments transformed into vast expanses of mud. Tents collapsed, fires refused to stay lit, and men slept in puddles, shivering through long nights and waking up ill. Pneumonia, typhoid, and every other illness that thrives in unsanitary and overcrowded conditions spread like wildfire. The death toll was staggering, with hundreds of men perishing each week, not from combat, but from disease and starvation. The Crusader army was withering away outside the walls of Antioch, while the defenders within remained secure and well supplied. Morale plummeted, and men began deserting in droves. Even some of the nobles lost hope. Peter the Hermit, who had survived the calamitous People's Crusade and joined the main army, attempted to flee under the cover of darkness. He was apprehended and brought back, utterly humiliated. The Crusader commanders found themselves in a state of desperation. They understood that a direct assault on the city was infeasible, given the formidable strength of the walls and the overwhelming numbers of the defenders. They required a miracle or a traitor, and they found a traitor. His name was Firuz, an Armenian Christian serving as a guard captain within Antioch. Discontented with the Turkish leadership, he saw an opportunity. He established contact with Bohemond of Taranto and offered to grant the Crusaders access to the city through a tower under his control. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, Bohemond led a small contingent of Crusaders to Firuz's tower. They ascended using ladders, subdued the guards, and opened the gates, allowing the Crusader army to pour into the city. What ensued was a horrifying massacre. The Crusaders, fueled by 8 months of suffering and rage, slaughtered indiscriminately, sparing neither Turkish soldiers nor civilians. The streets ran with blood, homes were looted, and women were subjected to brutal violence. It was a frenzy of barbarity that even shocked the chroniclers accompanying the Crusaders. However, the Crusaders' triumph was fleeting. Mere days after capturing Antioch, a massive Turkish relief army arrived, under the command of Kerboga, the Atabeg of Mosul. Suddenly, the Crusaders found themselves trapped within the very city they had just conquered, besieged by an army that far outnumbered them. The circumstances were dire. The Crusaders had exhausted the city's food provisions during their aggressive occupation. Now, they faced starvation within the fortifications while a Turkish force waited outside. Men resorted to consuming their horses, then progressed to eating leather, and subsequently subsisted on grass and leaves. Some individuals turned to cannibalism, though the chroniclers only allude to this with horrified whispers. Illness was widespread. The city was littered with bodies from the recent massacre, and under the summer sun they rotted, spreading plague. Deceased individuals were dying at a pace exceeding the capacity for burial. The Crusader army was disintegrating. And then, another occurrence, perceived by the Crusaders as a miracle, took place. A peasant named Peter Bartholomew asserted he had experienced a divine vision. He claimed the Holy Lance, the spear that had purportedly pierced Christ's side during his crucifixion, lay buried beneath the floor of Antioch's cathedral. The leaders of the crusade were doubtful, but their desperation was palpable. They required something to uplift the troops' spirits and instill hope. Consequently, they permitted Peter to commence digging. After several hours of excavation, he emerged from the pit, clutching a spearhead. Could it truly have been the Holy Lance? Almost certainly not. The majority of historians are of the opinion that Peter himself planted it. Nevertheless, its authenticity was inconsequential. The Crusaders believed, and this conviction provided them with the resolve to undertake an audacious action. They resolved to launch an offensive, to march from the city and confront Kerboga's army in an open confrontation. This was tantamount to suicide. They were outnumbered, famished, and weakened by illness. However, they possessed the Holy Lance. They believed God was on their side. On the 28th of June, in the year 1098, the Crusaders advanced from Antioch. They formed battle lines, holding the Holy Lance aloft, and charged the Turkish army. What transpired next astonished everyone, including the Crusaders themselves. The Turkish army faltered. Kerboga's confederation, composed of disparate Turkish factions possessing mutual distrust, disintegrated. Some contingents retreated, others fled. The Crusaders, who should have been annihilated, found themselves victorious. It was not a product of military brilliance, nor superior tactics. Rather, it was chance, coupled with the reality that Kerboga's army was less cohesive than it appeared. However, the Crusaders did not perceive it in this light. They interpreted it as divine intervention. God had granted them victory. The Holy Lance had proven effective. The siege of Antioch had concluded. Yet the price had been exceptionally high. Thousands of Crusaders had perished. The survivors bore profound physical and psychological wounds. Furthermore, they had not yet reached Jerusalem. They remained hundreds of miles from their ultimate objective. Nevertheless, they had acquired a valuable lesson. They had realized their capacity to endure any hardship. That regardless of the extremity of the circumstances, irrespective of how close they came to complete annihilation, they could, through some means, persevere. This realization rendered them more formidable, more zealous, and more inclined to perpetrate atrocities in the name of their sacred mission. For this was what the crusade had evolved into. Not a noble endeavor, but a desperate struggle for survival, where any act was deemed justifiable, any brutality excused, provided it advanced them closer to Jerusalem. Following the events at Antioch, the Crusaders faced a critical decision. They could recuperate, recover, and await reinforcements, or they could proceed immediately towards Jerusalem. The leaders engaged in protracted debates for months. Some advocated for consolidating their territorial gains. Others, notably Raymond of Toulouse, insisted on maintaining momentum. The longer they delayed, the more opportunity the Muslims would have to organize a defense. In January of the year 1999, the Crusaders eventually resumed their march. However, by this juncture, their numbers had drastically diminished. Disease, desertion, and combat losses had reduced their effective fighting force to approximately 15,000 men, with a comparable number of non-combatants, pilgrims, and camp followers. They journeyed southward along the coast, traversing regions now comprising Lebanon and Israel. The expedition was less arduous than the passage through Anatolia, though only marginally. They remained in hostile territory, susceptible to attack, and continued to grapple with logistical challenges. However, the most significant ordeal commenced when they turned inland towards Jerusalem. This necessitated crossing the Judean desert during the height of summer. And if you found the heat in Anatolia severe, the desert's conditions were considerably worse, indeed far worse. Temperatures in the Judean desert during the summer frequently surpass 110 degrees Fahrenheit. There is no shade, no water save for what one carries, and no respite from the relentless sun that beats down for hours on end, day after day. The Crusaders continued to wear their armor, a necessity for protection against potential attacks. Without it, they would have been defenseless. However, donning metal armor in such extreme heat was an ordeal of immense suffering. Men succumbed to heat stroke, with some losing their lives as their bodies simply failed under the oppressive temperatures. Water became more valuable than gold. The Crusaders were compelled to ration it meticulously, taking small sips to extend their dwindling supplies. Yet it was never sufficient. Men experienced hallucinations due to dehydration. Some resorted to drinking their own urine. Others engaged in violent altercations over water skins, killing one another for mere mouthfuls of lukewarm, stale water. The horses began to perish. Lacking both water and adequate sustenance, they could not survive. The Crusaders witnessed their steeds collapse and die one after another. This presented a catastrophic development for the knights, whose entire combat strategy relied upon mounted warfare. A knight without a horse was merely a man encumbered by heavy armor, slow and vulnerable. Furthermore, the desert teemed with scorpions, snakes, and insects that appeared to flourish in the intense heat. Men would awaken to discover scorpions in their boots or snakes within their sleeping rolls. Bites and stings were commonplace, and in the absence of appropriate medical attention, even a minor envenomation could prove fatal. The psychological impact was profound. The desert seemed interminable. Each day mirrored the preceding one, characterized by the same scorching sun, the same barren landscape, and the same agonizing thirst. Morale plummeted. Some individuals descended into madness, wandering off into the desert, never to be seen again. Despite these dire circumstances, the Crusaders pressed onward. They had no other recourse. Halting in the desert meant certain death. The sole path to survival lay in continuous movement, in perpetual advancement, and in the earnest hope that Jerusalem lay within reach. And finally, on the 7th of June, in the year 1099, their arduous journey culminated in the sight of their objective. The ramparts of Jerusalem emerged from the desert haze, reminiscent of a mirage, the holy city, the destination they had journeyed towards for 3 long years, the sacred site of Christ's suffering and resurrection, the city promised to cleanse all their sins. The Crusaders prostrated themselves and wept. After all they had endured, after all the death and suffering, they had finally arrived. They were here. However, their ordeal was far from over. In fact, the most challenging phase was yet to commence. For now, they were tasked with the formidable undertaking of actually capturing the city. Jerusalem stood as one of the world's most heavily fortified settlements. The city was defended by a garrison of Egyptian soldiers, in addition to its civilian populace. Its walls were exceptionally thick and towering, meticulously constructed to withstand prolonged sieges. It boasted multiple defensive layers, including numerous towers, gates, and fortifications that had been progressively enhanced over centuries. Meanwhile, the Crusaders were utterly exhausted, depleted in strength, and facing severe supply shortages. They possessed no siege equipment whatsoever, no catapults, no siege towers, nothing. They were compelled to construct all necessary apparatus from scratch, mirroring their previous endeavors at Nicaea and Antioch. However, a more significant impediment presented itself: the absolute absence of timber. The environs surrounding Jerusalem had been completely denuded of trees. The inhabitants had felled every tree and incinerated every wooden structure situated outside the city walls. Consequently, the Crusaders had no available materials from which to construct siege engines. They were forced to dispatch expeditions considerable distances to procure timber. These expeditions were fraught with peril and consumed substantial periods. Concurrently, the Crusaders encamped outside Jerusalem, enduring extreme heat with no shade, limited water, and rapidly diminishing food reserves. The oppressive summer heat claimed the lives of Crusaders daily. The situation had become critically desperate. The Crusaders recognized the imperative of capturing the city swiftly. Failure to do so, if the siege were to languish, would place them precariously between the city's defenders and an inevitable relief army. They would find themselves trapped, much like their predicament at Antioch. But this time, escape might well prove impossible. Therefore, they labored with frantic intensity, constructing siege towers and battering rams from any materials they could scavenge. This process spanned weeks. Weeks of suffering under the scorching sun. Weeks of witnessing comrades succumb to thirst and disease. Weeks of contemplating whether their arduous journey would culminate in failure at the ultimate hurdle. Nevertheless, by mid-July, the siege engines were finally operational. The Crusaders prepared for the decisive assault. They understood this was their final chance. Either they would conquer Jerusalem, or they would perish in the attempt. There was no middle ground, no possibility of retreat, and no option for surrender. On the 13th of July, in the year 1999, the assault commenced. And what ensued would be etched into history as one of the most sanguinary episodes in the annals of the Crusades. The offensive against Jerusalem began at the break of dawn. The Crusaders propelled their siege towers towards the city walls, supported by a barrage of covering fire from their archers. The defenders responded with their full complement of weaponry, unleashing volleys of arrows, stones, and boiling oil, projecting or pouring down anything capable of inflicting harm upon the attackers. The siege towers were colossal wooden structures, several stories in height, equipped with a drawbridge at their apex. This bridge was designed to be lowered onto the city walls, facilitating the rapid ingress of Crusader soldiers onto the battlements. However, maneuvering these towers to the walls was an undertaking fraught with extreme danger. The defenders relentlessly bombarded them with all available means. They hurled flaming torches in an attempt to set the towers ablaze. They directed a hail of arrows at the individuals pushing the towers, aiming to eliminate a sufficient number to halt their advance. The Crusaders had affixed wet hides to the towers as a protective measure against fire. Nevertheless, these hides were rapidly drying under the intense heat, diminishing their efficacy. Men were falling by the dozens, struck down as they exerted themselves to propel the towers forward. The initial assault proved unsuccessful. The siege towers were unable to reach the walls due to the overwhelming resistance. The defenders were too formidable, too thoroughly prepared. The Crusaders retreated, regrouped, and resumed their offensive on the following day, the 14th of July. This marked their second assault. This time, the Crusaders focused their efforts on a particular section of the northern wall. They propelled their siege tower forward, inch by painstaking inch, even as men perished around them. The defenders fought with the desperation of those who knew that a breach in the walls would spell the city's doom. And then, at long last, the tower met the wall. The drawbridge descended. Crusader soldiers surged across onto the battlements, commencing a brutal hand-to-hand engagement with the defenders. The foremost man to cross was a Flemish knight known as Lee. He battled his way onto the wall, with more Crusaders following in his wake. They secured a foothold, and then began advancing along the ramparts, dispatching defenders and clearing a path for further Crusader reinforcements. Simultaneously, another contingent of Crusaders had brought a battering ram to bear against one of the gates. They shattered the gate, and suddenly Crusaders were swarming into the city from numerous points. The defenders attempted to repel them, but they were utterly overwhelmed. The city was lost. What ensued was a slaughter that astonished even the medieval world, a period where violence was commonplace and brutality an expectation. the Crusaders lost all control. They annihilated everyone they encountered: Muslim soldiers, Muslim civilians, Jewish inhabitants who had resided in Jerusalem for countless generations, men, women, children, the elderly. It made no difference. The streets literally flowed with blood. Contemporary accounts recount blood reaching ankle-deep in some locales. Bodies were piled high in the thoroughfares. The Crusaders, driven by 3 years of hardship, fury, and religious fervor, were in a state of frenzy. They believed they were enacting God's will. These were infidels, unbelievers, who had occupied the holy city. Their deaths, in the Crusaders' eyes, were not murder, but righteous retribution. It was what God desired. The massacre persisted for several days. The Crusaders plundered every structure, seizing anything of value. They defiled mosques and synagogues. They set books ablaze and destroyed religious artifacts. It was a wholesale cultural annihilation. Some Muslims sought refuge in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, hoping the Crusaders would honor the sanctity of a place of worship. They were mistaken. The Crusaders stormed the mosque and put everyone inside to the sword. The floor became slick with blood. Jewish residents fled to their synagogue. The Crusaders sealed the doors and set the building ablaze, burning everyone within to death. Their screams echoed throughout the city. When it was finally over, after the Crusaders had sated their lust for killing, they convened at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They knelt and offered prayers, giving thanks to God for their victory. Tears of joy streamed down their faces, for they believed they had achieved something sacred. They had just perpetrated one of the most heinous atrocities of the medieval era. Yet, in their minds, they were heroes. They had reclaimed the holy city for Christendom. They had fulfilled their sacred vows. They had secured their place in heaven. The precise death toll is impossible to ascertain. Contemporary Muslim records report tens of thousands slain. Modern historians estimate the number of fatalities to be between 3,000 and 10,000. Regardless of the exact figure, it was a bloodbath that would embitter Christian-Muslim relations for centuries to come. And here is the crucial point. If you were a crusader, you were a participant in this event. You were not a passive observer. You were part of the army that committed these atrocities. Perhaps you personally took the lives of civilians. Perhaps you merely ransacked their homes. Perhaps you simply stood by and witnessed the carnage. But you were complicit. This is what the crusade had devolved into. Not a noble undertaking, but a campaign of conquest and slaughter. The promise of salvation had led to damnation. The holy war had become unholy. However, the Crusaders did not perceive it this way. They saw triumph. They saw the accomplishment of their mission. They saw Jerusalem finally under Christian dominion. And now they faced a new dilemma. What lay ahead? They had captured the city. But could they retain it? They were thousands of miles from Europe, encircled by hostile Muslim states, with dwindling provisions and a depleted army. The crusade might have concluded, but the true challenge, establishing and defending a Christian kingdom in the heart of the Muslim world, was merely commencing. Following the fall of Jerusalem, the majority of the Crusaders returned home. They had fulfilled their oaths, they had witnessed the holy city, and they had earned their spiritual recompense. Now they yearned to rejoin their families, their ancestral lands, and their former lives. However, a select few remained. A few thousand men, perhaps fewer, who resolved to stay in the Holy Land and forge a Christian kingdom. They named it the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and it stood as one of history's most precarious political entities. Consider the circumstances. You are a European knight in Jerusalem, surrounded by Muslim states whose forces vastly outnumber yours. Egypt lay to the south, Damascus to the north, and various Turkish emirates to the east. All of these entities sought to recapture Jerusalem, viewing you as an invader who must be expelled. Your supply lines stretched back to Europe, thousands of miles away. Reinforcements took months to arrive, if they arrived at all. You were reliant on ships from Italian city-states, such as Venice and Genoa, for commerce and sustenance. If these vessels ceased their voyages, you would be cut off. Furthermore, you were tasked with governing a populace that was predominantly Muslim and Jewish, people who harbored animosity towards you, who viewed you as occupiers, and who would gladly open the city gates to a Muslim army at the first opportunity. This was the reality of the Crusader states. They were not stable kingdoms, but military outposts, perpetually under threat and in a constant struggle for survival. The Crusaders attempted to institute a feudal system akin to that in Europe, dividing the land into fiefs granted to knights who, in turn, owed military service. They constructed fortifications, massive stone strongholds designed to withstand sieges and serve as bases for controlling the surrounding territory. These castles were truly impressive. Crac des Chevaliers, Marcabe, Belvoir. They were not mere defensive structures, but sophisticated military installations featuring multiple defensive layers, engineered by individuals who had accumulated decades of experience in siege warfare. Yet these castles could not resolve the fundamental issue of insufficient Crusader numbers. The Kingdom of Jerusalem could muster perhaps a few thousand knights at most, while the surrounding Muslim states could deploy tens of thousands. The Crusader states endured for as long as they did solely because the Muslim powers were fragmented, engaging in internal conflicts as much as they fought the Crusaders. Life within the Crusader states presented a peculiar existence. European knights resided in Middle Eastern cities, striving to preserve their European culture while simultaneously adapting to the local environment. They donned lighter armor to cope with the heat. They adopted local dietary customs. Some even acquired proficiency in the Arabic language. Intermarriage occurred. Christian knights wedded local Christian women, or occasionally Muslim women who converted. Offspring were born of mixed heritage, half European, half Middle Eastern. A new cultural identity began to emerge, distinct from both European and Middle Eastern traditions. However, this cultural fusion remained limited. The Crusaders constituted a ruling minority, separate from the indigenous population. They inhabited their castles and fortified cities, venturing out only when imperative. They did not assimilate. They occupied. The military situation was consistently precarious. The Crusaders had to maintain a perpetual state of readiness for attack. Muslim incursions were frequent. Caravans were ambushed. Villages were razed. This constituted low-level warfare that never truly ceased. The Crusaders developed strategies to address this. They established a network of castles that could provide mutual support. If one fortress came under attack, others could dispatch reinforcements. They employed mounted patrols to monitor enemy movements. They forged alliances with certain Muslim leaders, skillfully playing various factions against one another. Yet, this constant vigilance was exhausting. There was no opportunity for relaxation, no moment when one could lower their guard. The threat was ever present, perpetually awaiting the next assault. Then there was the climate. European knights were accustomed to cool, temperate weather. The Middle Eastern heat was relentless. Summer temperatures made wearing armor nearly unbearable. Diseases to which Europeans had no immunity, dysentery, malaria, various fevers, claimed as many Crusaders as direct combat. Water was a persistent concern. In Europe, water was readily available. In the Holy Land, particularly during the summer, it was scarce. Crusaders had to learn meticulous water management, rationing supplies, and knowing the precise location of every well and spring. Armies could be defeated simply by denying them access to water. Food presented another considerable challenge. The Crusaders attempted to maintain a European diet, but many European crops struggled to thrive in the Middle Eastern climate. They were compelled to adapt, consuming more local foods, a transition that some found difficult. There are accounts of Crusaders lamenting the food, expressing a longing for the bread and ale of their homeland. And finally, there was the psychological burden. They were far from home, surrounded by adversaries, living under constant peril. Many Crusaders became deeply pious, dedicating extensive time to prayer, visiting holy sites, and seeking meaning amidst their suffering. Others grew cynical and brutal, their sole focus on survival and personal enrichment. The Crusader states attracted a rough element: younger sons of European nobility who lacked inheritances, criminals evading justice, and adventurers in pursuit of wealth and renown. These individuals were not always the most noble or devout. They were often violent, avaricious men who saw the Holy Land as an avenue for personal advancement. This gave rise to internal conflicts, disputes over land, titles, and authority. The Crusader states were perpetually racked by internal strife, with various factions clashing among themselves almost as frequently as they engaged the Muslims. All of this unfolded while the Muslim world was gradually consolidating its strength. Leaders such as Zini and his son, Nur ad-Din, were consolidating their authority, bringing various Muslim groups under their command. They were actively assembling forces specifically equipped for combat against the Crusaders. Furthermore, they were developing tactical approaches and strategies to counteract the strengths of the Crusader armies. The Crusaders could foresee the inevitable. The Muslim world was gaining strength, while the Crusader states were weakening. It was only a matter of time before a formidable Muslim leader would emerge, capable of uniting the disparate factions and initiating a well-coordinated campaign to reclaim Jerusalem. That leader would be Saladin, and upon his arrival, the Crusader states would confront their most severe crisis. Saladin, or Salahaddin as he was known in Arabic, was born in the year 1137 in Trit, a location now within modern-day Iraq. He hailed from a Kurdish military family and ascended through the ranks of the Muslim military establishment, driven by skill, ambition, and astute political maneuvering. By 1174, Saladin had attained the position of Sultan of Egypt and Syria. He had successfully united two of the most potent Muslim states under his dominion, an accomplishment not seen since the initial stages of the Crusades. His singular objective was to recapture Jerusalem. Saladin was not only a brilliant military commander, but also a shrewd politician. He recognized that to defeat the Crusaders, he needed to unite the Muslim world. Consequently, he dedicated years to forging alliances, negotiating treaties, and solidifying his power. He presented himself as the protector of Islam, the leader destined to finally drive out the Christian invaders. The Crusaders observed his ascent with increasing apprehension. They understood he was unlike previous Muslim leaders, possessing greater capability, determination, and posing a more significant threat. In 1187, Saladin was prepared. He gathered a substantial army, estimated to be around 30,000 men, and advanced towards the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Crusaders responded by mobilizing their own troops, enlisting every available knight and soldier, totaling approximately 20,000 men. This represented the largest Crusader army ever assembled. The two armies converged at a site known as the Horns of Hattin, situated near the Sea of Galilee. The events that transpired there would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Crusader history. The Crusaders committed a grave error. They abandoned their fortified positions and marched across open terrain during the height of summer, intending to relieve a castle that Saladin was besieging. It was a meticulously planned trap. Saladin had strategically positioned his forces to intercept the Crusaders' access to water sources. The Crusader army found itself stranded in a desolate landscape under the intense July heat, completely devoid of water. Saladin's forces encircled them and initiated a campaign of attrition. They avoided direct confrontation. Instead, they kept the Crusaders pinned down under the scorching sun, gradually succumbing to thirst. The Crusaders attempted to break through to reach water supplies, but their efforts were in vain. Saladin's forces were too numerous and strategically superior. The Crusader army was effectively trapped. As darkness descended, Saladin's troops set fire to the dry vegetation surrounding the Crusader encampment. Smoke billowed into the air, making respiration increasingly difficult. The Crusaders endured a night of torment, enveloped by fire and smoke, dying from thirst, acutely aware that the following day would bring the decisive battle. On July 4, 1187, the Battle of Hattin commenced. The Crusaders, driven by desperation and dehydration, attempted to fight their way to freedom, but they were exhausted, disorganized, and vastly outnumbered. Saladin's forces systematically decimated them. The Crusader army was utterly destroyed. Thousands perished in the conflict. Thousands more were taken prisoner, including Guy of Jerusalem, the king, and a significant portion of the Crusader nobility. This marked the most devastating military catastrophe in Crusader history. Saladin displayed clemency towards most of the captives. He secured ransoms for the nobles and liberated many of the common soldiers. However, a single exception was made. The Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, military orders sworn to fight Muslims unto death, were executed. Saladin ordered their beheading, all of them, as a stark message to the Crusader world. With the Crusader army annihilated, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was left defenseless. Saladin advanced from one city to another, accepting surrenders. Most settlements capitulated without resistance, recognizing the futility of opposition. Then, in September of 1187, Saladin arrived at Jerusalem, the city that the Crusaders had captured 88 years prior, the city for whose conquest they had massacred thousands. Now it was Saladin's turn, but he did not engage in a massacre of the inhabitants. He extended terms of surrender. Christians were permitted to depart peacefully upon payment of a ransom. Those unable to meet this demand would be taken into servitude, but there would be no widespread slaughter. The city capitulated on October 2, 1187. Saladin entered Jerusalem and immediately commanded the mosques to be purified and rededicated. The most crucial city of the Crusader kingdom, the very reason for the entire crusade, was now back under Muslim control. The news reached Europe like a thunderclap. Jerusalem had fallen. The holy city was lost. The Crusader states teetered on the brink of collapse. Action was imperative. Pope Innocent III called for a new crusade, the Third Crusade. This time, the response was unprecedented. 3 of Europe's most powerful monarchs took up the cross: Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Philip Augustus of France, and Richard the Lionheart of England. This would be known as the Crusade of Kings, the most formidable military expedition ever dispatched to the Holy Land. Surely, with such leadership and such resources, Jerusalem could be retaken. However, the Third Crusade would demonstrate that even kings could not surmount the inherent challenges of crusading: the vast distances, the logistical complexities, the harsh climate, and a determined enemy. These obstacles remained indifferent to royal titles or military accolades. Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, led a formidable German army overland through Anatolia. But in June of 1190, while attempting to cross a river in southern Turkey, he tragically drowned. The greatest warrior king of his era met his end in a senseless accident. His army, demoralized and leaderless, largely disintegrated. Some contingent continued their journey to the Holy Land, but the majority returned home. Philip Augustus and Richard the Lionheart opted for sea travel, arriving in the Holy Land in 1191. They immediately commenced the siege of Acre, a coastal city that Saladin had previously captured. The siege endured for months and was marked by extreme brutality. Disease afflicted both sides, resulting in thousands of fatalities. Finally, in July of 1191, Acre surrendered. However, this victory came at a significant cost. Philip Augustus, ill and exhausted, decided he had endured enough. He returned home, leaving Richard to continue the crusade alone. Richard was a superb military commander. He secured several victories against Saladin, including a notable triumph at Arsuf, but he was unable to recapture Jerusalem. Each time he advanced towards the city, he arrived at the same conclusion: even if he managed to capture it, he could not sustain control. His army was insufficient in size, and his supply lines were overly extended. It mirrored the dire situation at Hattin. Consequently, Richard pursued a pragmatic course of action. He initiated negotiations. In September of 1192, he and Saladin reached an accord. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim administration, but Christian pilgrims would be granted access. The coastal cities would stay under Crusader jurisdiction. It was not a resounding victory, but it averted complete defeat. Richard returned home, and the Third Crusade concluded. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. The Crusader states persevered, albeit precariously. They were reduced to a narrow coastal strip, reliant on support from Europe and perpetually under threat. The Crusades would persist. For another century, European armies would continue to journey to the Holy Land, endeavoring to reclaim what had been lost. Yet, they would ultimately fail. Jerusalem would continue to be under Muslim dominion until the 20th century. If you believed that the Crusades could not become any more calamitous, disorganized, or morally compromised, allow me to introduce the Fourth Crusade. This is where the entire crusading movement faltered and revealed its true nature. A facade for avarice, political ambition, and unadulterated conquest, artfully disguised in religious rhetoric. The Fourth Crusade was proclaimed by Pope Innocent III in 1198. The objective remained consistent: to recapture Jerusalem. This time, however, the Crusaders opted for a different strategy. Instead of marching overland or sailing directly to the Holy Land, they resolved to attack Egypt first. Egypt served as the power base for Muslim resistance. By conquering Egypt, Jerusalem would inevitably follow. This was, in fact, a sound strategic plan, but it demanded a substantial fleet of ships, a naval capacity the Crusaders lacked. Consequently, they entered into an agreement with Venice. The Venetians pledged to provide ships for transporting the Crusader army to Egypt. In return, the Crusaders were obligated to pay 85,000 marks, an immense sum. The Crusaders assented, confident in their ability to raise the funds. However, they proved incapable. When the Crusader army convened in Venice in 1202, they were significantly short of the required amount. They had only managed to collect approximately 51,000 marks. The Venetians, under the leadership of their elderly yet astute Doge Enrico Dandolo, faced a predicament. They had constructed a fleet specifically for this crusade, investing substantial resources. Now the Crusaders could not fulfill their financial obligations. Dandolo proposed a solution. The Crusaders could offset their debt by assisting Venice with a minor issue. The city of Zara, located on the Dalmatian coast, had revolted against Venetian control. If the Crusaders would aid in recapturing Zara, Venice would defer payment and provide the ships. There was, however, one significant complication. Zara was a Christian city. It was under the protection of the King of Hungary, who himself had taken Crusader vows. Attacking Zara meant Crusaders targeting fellow Christians. Pope Innocent III explicitly forbade this action. He issued warnings that anyone assaulting Zara would face excommunication. Nevertheless, the Crusaders were in a desperate situation. They desperately needed those ships. Thus, they attacked Zara nonetheless. Zara fell in November of 1202. The Crusaders plundered a Christian city, inflicting casualties upon Christians in the name of a crusade purportedly aimed at combating Muslims. The Pope was incensed. He excommunicated the entire Crusader army and the Venetians. The situation, however, worsened considerably. While the Crusaders were in Zara, they received a visit from Alexios Angelos, a Byzantine prince. Alexios presented a problem. His father, the Byzantine emperor, had been deposed and blinded by Alexios's uncle. Now, Alexios desired his throne back and was prepared to compensate for assistance. He presented the Crusaders with an offer. If they aided him in reclaiming the Byzantine throne, he would pay them 200,000 marks. Furthermore, he would furnish troops and provisions for the expedition to Egypt and would facilitate the reunion of the Eastern Orthodox Church with Rome, thereby mending the schism that had divided Christianity for over a century. It seemed too favorable to be true, and indeed, it proved to be so. However, the Crusaders, in dire need of funds and convinced of the righteousness of their cause, accepted. In June of the year 1203, the Crusader fleet reached Constantinople. This was the preeminent Christian city in the world, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and for centuries it had served as the bulwark of Christianity against Islam. Ironically, the Crusaders had arrived to attack it. The Byzantines were horrified. They had requested aid against the Turks, but instead a Crusader army appeared, demanding they replace their emperor. The reigning emperor, Alexios III, fled. The Crusaders then installed Alexios IV, their chosen candidate, upon the throne. However, Alexios IV was unable to fulfill his promises. He did not possess 200,000 marks, as the Byzantine treasury was depleted. Moreover, the Byzantine populace despised him for bringing the Crusaders to their city. Riots erupted in January of 1204. Alexios IV was overthrown and subsequently murdered. A new emperor, Alexios V, ascended to power and commanded the Crusaders to depart. The Crusaders were incensed. They had been promised payment and support. Now they had nothing. Consequently, they made a decision that would reverberate through history. They would conquer Constantinople. They would plunder the greatest Christian city in the world, taking by force what they had been promised. In April of 1204, the Crusader army assaulted Constantinople. The city's defenses, which had successfully withstood numerous Muslim sieges, succumbed to a Christian army. The Crusaders breached the walls and poured into the city. What ensued was one of the most calamical sacks in history. The Crusaders looted indiscriminately. Churches, monasteries, palaces, and residences were plundered. Gold, silver, jewels, sacred relics, artworks, and anything of value were stolen. Items that could not be carried away were destroyed. Libraries were burned, and priceless artifacts were smashed. They committed acts of rape and murder and desecrated churches. Golden icons were melted down for their metal. The bronze horses from the hippodrome were taken and transported to Venice, where they remain to this day. The sack of Constantinople persisted for 3 days. Upon its conclusion, the greatest city in Christendom lay in smoldering ruins. Centuries of accumulated wealth, art, and knowledge were either destroyed or dispersed. The Byzantine Empire, which for 800 years had shielded Europe from Islam, was critically weakened. The Crusaders divided the Byzantine Empire amongst themselves, establishing the Latin Empire of Constantinople, a Crusader state situated in the heart of the Byzantine world. This entity would endure for less than 60 years before the Byzantines recaptured their capital. However, the damage was irreparable. The Byzantine Empire never fully recuperated, and the planned crusade to Egypt never materialized. The Crusaders had become distracted by the opportunity to loot Constantinople, neglecting Jerusalem, the fight against Muslims, and the fundamental purpose of the crusade. Pope Innocent III was appalled. He had initiated a crusade to combat Islam, yet the Crusaders had instead devastated the Byzantine Empire. He penned letters condemning the sack, but the deed was done. The Fourth Crusade had exposed the crusading movement for what it had devolved into, an instrument of conquest and avarice, where religious justifications served merely as a superficial guise for unbridled ambition. The Fourth Crusade proved disastrous for Christianity. It permanently weakened the Byzantine Empire, thereby facilitating its eventual conquest by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. It exacerbated the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity, fostering animosity that persists to the present day. Furthermore, it eroded any remaining moral authority the crusading movement might have possessed. Following the Fourth Crusade, it became evident that crusades were no longer about defending Christianity or reclaiming the Holy Land. They had transformed into contests of power, wealth, and political maneuvering. Religious rhetoric persisted, but its sincerity had largely vanished. If the Fourth Crusade elucidated the corruption and cynicism within the crusading movement, then the Children's Crusade demonstrated its sheer madness. This stands as one of the most peculiar and tragic episodes in crusading history, vividly illustrating the pervasive influence of crusading fervor throughout medieval society. In the year 1212, two distinct movements emerged, one in France and the other in Germany. Both were spearheaded by young individuals, possibly children or adolescents, as the historical accounts are not entirely precise. Nevertheless, the underlying narrative remains consistent. These youths claim to have received divine visions instructing them to march to the Holy Land and recapture Jerusalem. The French movement was led by a shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes. He asserted that Christ had appeared to him and delivered a letter for the King of France. This letter purportedly declared that children, through their innocence and purity, could achieve what adult crusaders had failed to accomplish: the reclamation of Jerusalem through faith alone, without resorting to violence. Stephen commenced his preaching, attracting thousands of young followers. They journeyed southward towards the Mediterranean, laboring under the belief that upon reaching the sea, God would part the waters, enabling them to walk to the Holy Land, much like Moses leading the Israelites through the Red Sea. The German movement was headed by a boy named Nicholas. He assembled thousands of adherents and guided them southward through the Alps towards Italy. The journey was arduous, with many succumbing to exposure, starvation, or accidents in the mountains. Despite these hardships, the survivors pressed onward, fueled by their faith and the conviction of being on a divine mission. Neither movement successfully reached the Holy Land. Stephen's followers arrived at Marseilles, and the sea did not part. Some abandoned their quest and returned home. Others were allegedly sold into slavery by merchants who ostensibly promised passage to the Holy Land, but instead transported them to North Africa, where they were sold to Muslim slavers. Nicholas's followers reached Genoa, and again the sea remained unparted. The movement dissolved. Some attempted to continue to Rome, hoping for the Pope's endorsement, which they did not receive. He instructed them to return home, a command most obeyed, though many perished during the homeward journey. The Children's Crusade proved to be a catastrophe, resulting in the deaths or enslavement of thousands of young individuals, all for the sake of a vision, a belief that faith alone could achieve what armies could not. However, what is truly disturbing about the Children's Crusade is its genesis. Medieval society had become so saturated with crusading ideology that even children felt compelled to participate in holy wars. The incessant preaching, the tales of crusader heroism, and the promise of salvation had cultivated a cultural environment where crusading appeared to be the paramount undertaking. Even adults perpetuated this fervor. Parents allowed their children to depart. Priests offered blessings, and communities provided support. No one paused to consider that dispatching children on a 1,000-mile journey to wage war might be an ill-advised endeavor. The Children's Crusade is often dismissed as a minor detail, a peculiar anomaly. Yet, it serves as a perfect illustration of how crusading had distorted medieval society. It fostered a culture where religious fanaticism superseded common sense, and where faith was valued above the safety and well-being of children. It demonstrated that the crusading movement had exhausted its innovative spirit. Following the catastrophic Fourth Crusade and decades of failure in the Holy Land, the only novel strategy conceived was the notion that perhaps children could succeed. It was a desperate, irrational, and tragic undertaking. The Children's Crusade marked a turning point, after which enthusiasm for crusading began to wane. People started questioning whether these expeditions were truly aligned with God's will, or merely costly, perilous failures. The crusading movement would persist for another century, but it would never again capture the public imagination as it had in its nascent stages. Post the Children's Crusade, the crusading movement entered its final phase. Although further expeditions and attempts to reclaim Jerusalem were mounted, they all ultimately proved unsuccessful. The era of the Crusades was drawing to a close, though this was not yet fully comprehended. The Fifth Crusade, launched in 1217, again targeted Egypt. The Crusaders successfully captured the port city of Damietta after a protracted siege. However, they then committed a crucial error, marching inland towards Cairo during the Nile flood season. The Egyptians opened the dams, inundating the Crusader camp. The Crusaders found themselves trapped, surrounded by water, and compelled to surrender. They relinquished Damietta and retreated in ignominy. The Sixth Crusade, led by Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, was, in fact, successful, though not through military confrontation. Frederick negotiated a 10-year truce with the Egyptian Sultan, securing control of Jerusalem in exchange. This was a diplomatic triumph, but generated controversy, as many Christians believed that negotiation with Muslims was reprehensible and that Jerusalem should have been seized by force rather than diplomacy. Moreover, the treaty proved transient. In 1244, a Turkish army recaptured Jerusalem, which remained under Muslim control for the subsequent 673 years until its capture by British forces during World War I. The Seventh Crusade, led by King Louis IX of France, resulted in another debacle. Louis invaded Egypt in 1248, recaptured Damietta once more, and then advanced towards Cairo. However, similar to the Fifth Crusade, his army became mired. Disease ravaged the Crusader encampment, and Louis himself contracted dysentery. The Crusaders were defeated, and Louis was captured, necessitating the payment of an immense ransom for his release. Louis attempted a further expedition with the Eighth Crusade in 1270, this time directing his efforts towards Tunis in North Africa. This crusade never even reached the Holy Land. Disease afflicted the Crusader encampment with striking immediacy. Louis succumbed to dysentery, leading to the disintegration of the crusade. By this juncture, it was evident that the age of crusading had concluded. The Crusader states within the Holy Land were diminishing, ceding territory to Muslim forces. The final significant Crusader bastion, Acre, fell in the year 1291. The remaining Crusaders withdrew to Cyprus, marking the end of a Crusader presence in the Holy Land after nearly 2 centuries. The Crusades had ultimately failed. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. The Crusader states had vanished. Countless individuals had perished. And for what purpose? The Holy Land was no more Christian than it had been prior to the initial crusade. In reality, the Crusades had exacerbated the situation. They engendered centuries of animosity between Christians and Muslims. They weakened the Byzantine Empire, rendering it susceptible to eventual conquest by the Ottoman Turks. They diverted resources and attention from other pressing issues confronting medieval Europe. And the human toll was immense. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives during the Crusades, encompassing soldiers, civilians, Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Entire communities were annihilated, cities were plundered, cultures were devastated. For the individual crusader, the experience was almost universally grim. One would endure years of marching through hostile territories, engaging in combat under brutal conditions, and witnessing friends succumb to disease and violence. Should one survive, they would return home traumatized, possibly maimed, and irrevocably altered by their experiences. And all for what? The promise of salvation, the absolution of sins. Was it truly worth it? For the majority of Crusaders, the answer was likely no. However, they had taken a sacred vow. They had pledged allegiance to the cross. And in the medieval era, the violation of a vow constituted a grave transgression. Consequently, they persevered, continuing their fight and enduring suffering, as turning back appeared more arduous than pressing onward. The Crusades were a tragedy, a profound multi-generational calamity, fueled by religious zeal, political aspiration, and the allure of spiritual rewards that may or may not have been genuine. They achieved little of enduring significance and inflicted widespread suffering. Nevertheless, they profoundly shaped the world we inhabit today. The Crusades fostered an enduring enmity between the Christian and Muslim realms. They influenced European perspectives on the Middle East for centuries, They contributed to advancements in military technology, castle construction, and naval warfare. They facilitated cultural exchange, introducing Eastern ideas, technologies, and goods to Europe. However, these advantages, if they can be termed as such, came at an extraordinary price. And for the individual crusader, for those who personally lived through these campaigns, the Crusades represented a hell on earth. Let us discuss an aspect that receives insufficient attention when the Crusades are debated: disease. Because if you were a crusader, you were vastly more likely to perish from illness than from a Muslim blade. Infinitely more likely. The medieval comprehension of disease was rudimentary. People adhered to the theory of humors, the belief that sickness resulted from an imbalance of bodily fluids. They lacked an understanding of germs, bacteria, or viruses. They were unaware of sanitation or hygiene as we perceive them today. Consequently, when tens of thousands of individuals were assembled in crowded encampments with inadequate sanitation, limited access to clean water, and no grasp of disease transmission, the ideal conditions for epidemics were created. Dysentery was the predominant killer. It is a bacterial infection affecting the intestines, inducing severe diarrhea, frequently accompanied by blood. In the medieval period, devoid of antibiotics and with limited medical knowledge, dysentery was often fatal. Individuals would become dehydrated, weakened, and ultimately perish, and dysentery spread with alarming rapidity through crusader camps. The sanitation was appalling. People would relieve themselves wherever possible, often in proximity to water sources. The water would become contaminated, leading to consumption by individuals, thereby propagating the disease. Contemporary accounts describe crusader camps where hundreds of men were dying daily from dysentery. The stench was overpowering. The suffering was immense, and there was nothing anyone could do except attempt to remain hydrated and hope for survival. Typhoid fever constituted another significant mortality cause. It too is transmitted through contaminated water, and symptoms include high fever, weakness, and abdominal discomfort. Similar to dysentery, it proved frequently fatal during the medieval era. Then there was malaria, transmitted by mosquitoes. The Crusaders were unaware of mosquitoes as vectors of disease. They merely observed that individuals camping near swamps or marshes frequently fell ill with recurring fevers. Malaria could be lethal, but more often it induced chronic ailments, weakening individuals and rendering them susceptible to other maladies. Scurvy presented a problem during extended sea voyages. It stems from a deficiency in vitamin C, leading to bleeding gums, loosened teeth, and eventual demise. Crusaders undertaking sea travel often arrived in the Holy Land already weakened by scurvy. Furthermore, there were wound infections. In an era predating antibiotics, even a minor injury could become infected and prove fatal. A sword cut, an arrow wound, even a blister that became infected. Any of these could lead to sepsis and death. The Crusaders possessed some medical knowledge. They had physicians and surgeons who accompanied the armies. However, their treatments were often ineffectual or even detrimental. Bloodletting, the practice of intentionally draining blood from a patient, was a prevalent treatment that likely claimed more lives than it saved. They did, however, have some effective remedies. They utilized wine to cleanse wounds, which proved beneficial due to the alcohol's antiseptic properties. They employed honey as a wound dressing, also effective due to honey's antibacterial qualities. Yet, they did not comprehend the underlying reasons for these treatments' efficacy, thus preventing consistent application of the principles. The heat compounded every issue. During the Middle Eastern summer, temperatures could surpass 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Dehydration was a perpetual concern. Heat stroke claimed numerous crusaders, and the heat accelerated disease proliferation as bacteria thrived in the warm environment. The Crusaders endeavored to adapt. They learned to boil water before consumption, though they did not grasp the rationale behind this practice. They learned to avoid camping near stagnant water sources. They learned to promptly inter their dead to prevent disease transmission. Yet, these measures yielded only partial success. Disease remained the paramount killer throughout the Crusades. Some estimations indicate that for every crusader who perished in combat, 3 or 4 succumbed to illness, and disease displayed no favoritism. It claimed the lives of nobles and commoners, knights and foot soldiers, the devout and the skeptical. One's bravery, swordsmanship, or strength of faith were irrelevant. Disease could eliminate an individual as readily as it did the most vulnerable member of the army. This represents one of the harsh realities of the Crusades that is frequently overlooked. The Crusaders were not solely confronting Muslims. They were battling an unseen adversary they neither understood nor could vanquish. An enemy that was perpetually present, constantly menacing, and relentlessly deadly. If you were a Crusader, you lived with the pervasive apprehension of illness. You witnessed your companions grow ill and expire. You pondered if you would be next. You endeavored to maintain your health, to avoid contaminated water, to keep your wounds clean. Ultimately, however, whether you survived or not was largely a matter of chance, and if you did fall ill, your options were constrained. You could attempt to endure, trusting your body to combat the infection. You could seek assistance from a physician who might perform bloodletting, or administer herbal remedies that likely offered little benefit, or you could engage in prayer, imploring divine intervention for your protection, and vowing to become a more devout Christian should you recover. Many Crusaders made confessions from their deathbeds, convinced they were facing divine retribution for their transgressions. They would request final rites, receive communion one last time, and then pass away in a tent thousands of miles from home, surrounded by strangers. This was the reality of participating in the Crusades. Not glorious battles and heroic exploits, but slow, agonizing deaths from illnesses that no one comprehended and no one could cure. Let us address a subject that medieval chroniclers seldom discussed, yet which must have been a significant factor in the Crusades: the psychological impact. Because if you survived the journey, the battles, and the diseases, you still had to contend with the mental and emotional trauma of your experiences. Imagine being a crusader who has been on campaign for 3 years. You have marched thousands of miles. You have fought in numerous battles. You have witnessed friends die, sometimes in your embrace. You have taken lives, perhaps many lives. You have observed atrocities, perhaps even participated in them. You have experienced hunger, thirst, sickness, and terror, and now you are returning home. You are among the fortunate survivors, but you are not the same individual who departed. How could you be? Medieval individuals lacked a concept of PTSD, or trauma, in the way we understand it today. However, they acknowledged that warfare transformed individuals. Chronicles refer to crusaders who returned home melancholic or troubled in spirit. Some entered monastic life to find solace. Others became violent, unable to reintegrate into a peaceful society. The events that crusaders witnessed and perpetrated would haunt anyone. The massacre at Jerusalem, where crusaders slaughtered thousands of civilians. The sack of Constantinople, where Christians devastated the preeminent Christian city in the world. The countless smaller acts of brutality: villages burned, prisoners executed, civilians caught in the crossfire. Even if one attempted to rationalize these actions as necessary for the crusade, as divine will, a part of them had to recognize their inherent wrongness. A part of them had to be disturbed by their deeds. And then there was the disillusionment. You were told the crusade was a holy endeavor, that divine protection was assured, and that your cause was just. However, you witnessed crusaders perish gruesomely. You observed the crusade devolve into savagery and anarchy. You saw leaders driven more by avarice and aspiration than by piety. How do you reconcile these realities with the initial assurances? How do you preserve your faith when faced with so much that contradicts the notion of a benevolent and just God? Some crusaders entirely lost their faith. They returned home disillusioned and resentful, no longer believing in the church or its assurances. Others intensified their devotion, becoming more pious, attempting to comprehend their experiences through prayer and worship. Then there was the burden of guilt. If you survived when so many met their end, you might feel responsible. Why did you live when your comrades did not? What made you exceptional? Or if you committed acts you regretted, such as killing civilians, desecrating churches, or participating in atrocities, that guilt would remain with you perpetually. The medieval church offered confession and penance as remedies for guilt. You could confess your transgressions to a priest, receive absolution, and theoretically be pardoned. But did this truly provide solace? Could a few prayers and some penance genuinely erase the recollection of your actions? For numerous Crusaders, the answer was no. They carried their guilt and trauma throughout their lives. Some became reclusive, unable to connect with those who had not shared their experiences. Others resorted to violence, externalizing their trauma destructively. There was no support system, no therapy, no counseling, no veteran services. You were expected to simply resume your life, to return to farming or your previous occupation, and act as though nothing had changed. But it was not normal. You had witnessed sights that most could not even conceive. You had endured horrors that would haunt your sleep for years, and you had to confront them in isolation. A few Crusaders found comfort in conversing with fellow veterans, sharing their experiences with those who understood. Yet even this was constrained. Medieval society did not encourage men to express their emotions or admit to psychological distress. Strength, endurance, and discretion were expected. The psychological impact of the Crusades was immense, even if it was unrecognized or unacknowledged at the time. Thousands of men returned home traumatized, altered by their experiences, struggling to reintegrate into ordinary life. And for what? For a crusade that ultimately faltered. For a promise of salvation that might have been illusory. For a cause that, in retrospect, appears deeply flawed. The Crusades broke people, not merely physically, but mentally and emotionally. This is another reason why you would not have survived. Even if you returned home alive, in a true sense, you would not have survived. A part of you would have perished in the desert, at the siege, or in the moment you realized the crusade you had been told about was a fabrication. Consider another aspect that is seldom discussed: the economic ramifications of crusading. Undertaking a crusade was not only perilous and arduous, but also financially ruinous for the majority of participants. Let us begin with the essentials. If you were a knight, you required equipment. A complete suit of chainmail cost approximately the same as a modest farm. A fine war horse was even more expensive. You also needed weaponry, a sword, a lance, a shield. Provisions for the journey were necessary: food, water, camping gear. And you required funds to sustain yourself throughout the crusade, which could extend for years. Most knights were compelled to sell or mortgage their estates to finance their participation. They would obtain loans from Jewish moneylenders or Italian financiers, promising repayment with interest upon their return. If they perished on crusade, their families remained burdened with the debt. Their lands might be confiscated. Their wives and children could be left in destitution. The crusade, intended to redeem your soul, could devastate your family's future. Even if you survived, you might return to find your lands occupied by neighbors or relatives who presumed you deceased. Medieval property law was intricate, and asserting your claim after an extended absence could prove challenging, if not impossible. For peasants, the economic consequences differed but were equally dire. If you embarked on a crusade, you ceased working your land. Your crops went unplanted or unharvested. Your family had to subsist without your labor, often leading to hunger. Furthermore, you bore the expense of your passage. The church and nobility did not furnish transportation or sustenance for common crusaders. You were obliged to walk, carrying what you could, begging or laboring en route to earn funds for food. Many peasant crusaders never reached home. They perished during the journey, settled in the Crusader states, or simply vanished. Their families back home never learned of their fate, only that their husband, father, or son had departed and never returned. The Crusades also exerted broader economic influences across Europe. The departure of thousands of men for extended periods disrupted labor markets. Fields remained fallow. Workshops ceased operations. Trade routes were interrupted. Conversely, the Crusades did foster some economic activity. Italian city-states, such as Venice and Genoa, amassed fortunes transporting Crusaders and engaging in trade with the East. The demand for ships, armaments, and provisions generated employment, and the Crusades opened new trade avenues, introducing Eastern commodities like spices, silk, and sugar to European markets. However, for the individual Crusader, the economic impact was almost invariably negative. You expended a substantial sum to participate in a crusade and received nothing in return. There was a scarcity of plunder, contrary to any promises. Muslim cities were well fortified, and even when Crusaders succeeded in capturing them, the spoils were typically distributed among the leaders, leaving common soldiers with little or nothing. The sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade stands as an exception. Immense wealth was acquired, and many Crusaders indeed prospered, but this involved a Christian city, not a Muslim one. The fact that Crusaders enriched themselves by plundering fellow Christians merely underscored the corruption within the crusading movement. For most Crusaders, the economic reality was bleak. You would deplete your entire savings to join a crusade, endure years of hardship, and if you survived, return home penniless, possibly indebted, with no tangible reward for your sacrifice, other than the assurance of forgiven sins. And that assurance, in economic terms, was worth precisely nothing. You could neither consume it, nor use it to settle debts, nor support your family. It was a spiritual recompense, and spiritual rewards do not put food on the table. This is yet another reason why the Crusades proved such a calamity for those who participated. They were not only physically and psychologically devastating, but also economically ruinous. They impoverished individuals and families, disrupted communities, and diverted resources from productive endeavors to a military campaign that ultimately yielded no significant results. If you were a medieval peasant or knight contemplating the decision to take up the cross, the prudent economic choice was clear. Do not go. Remain at home. Cultivate your land. Care for your family. The crusade would financially destroy you, and the spiritual benefits did not justify the cost. Yet people went nonetheless, because the church commanded it, because their lords exerted pressure, because they believed the promises of salvation, because they were swept up in the prevailing religious fervor, and they paid the price in blood, suffering, and gold. So, let us consolidate this. Let us examine why you, specifically, would not have survived the Crusades. Firstly, the physical demands. You are unprepared for the level of physical hardship the Crusades entailed. You are accustomed to climate-controlled environments, comfortable bedding, and regular meals. The Crusaders marched 20 miles daily, clad in armor, enduring extreme heat with limited sustenance and hydration. Could you sustain this for months while afflicted with dysentery? You are unaccustomed to violence. You have likely never engaged in a genuine fight, let alone a medieval battle where combatants aim to kill you with swords and arrows. The psychological shock of combat, the fear, the adrenaline, the chaos would overwhelm you. You lack the requisite skills. Medieval Crusaders were trained from childhood in weaponry, horsemanship, and the tactics of medieval warfare. You possess none of this training. In battle, you would be defenseless. You lack the appropriate mindset. Medieval individuals accepted suffering and death in a manner that modern people do not. They held beliefs in an afterlife, divine judgment, and the significance of a well-chosen death. You likely do not share these beliefs, at least not with the same intensity. When circumstances became difficult, when those around you began to perish, you would want to abandon the endeavor. You would wish to return home. But there was no returning home. You were thousands of miles from Europe, surrounded by adversaries with no recourse but to advance. Diseases would claim you. You have no immunity to the prevalent diseases that decimated Crusader camps. Dysentery, typhoid, malaria, these would severely affect you. And without modern medicine, without antibiotics, you would likely succumb. The heat would be fatal. You are not acclimatized to Middle Eastern temperatures. The first time you attempted to march in full armor under 110 degrees Fahrenheit heat, you would collapse from heat stroke. The food would make you ill. Medieval fare was coarse, often spoiled or contaminated. Your modern digestive system, accustomed to processed, sanitized food, would struggle to tolerate it. You would be perpetually unwell. The water would prove deadly. Medieval crusaders drank from rivers, wells, and cisterns that were frequently tainted. You would contract dysentery or typhoid from the water and perish. The psychological trauma would shatter you. Even if you miraculously endured the physical hardships, the sights and experiences would leave you deeply scarred. The violence, the agony, the horrific acts. You would develop post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. With no access to treatment, you would simply have to live with these burdens, assuming you survived at all. Your fellow crusaders would present a significant challenge. These were not gentle individuals. They were medieval warriors, many of them violent, ruthless men who saw no issue with killing, pillaging, and violating others. You would be surrounded by people whose values and conduct would appall you. To avoid becoming an outcast, vulnerable and alone, you would have to conform to their norms. The language barrier would be an immense obstacle. You do not speak medieval French, German, or Latin. You would be unable to communicate with your fellow crusaders, let alone the local populations. This would lead to isolation, rendering you incapable of understanding commands, requesting assistance, or navigating the social complexities of the crusade. The religious fervor would be deeply unsettling. The Crusaders genuinely believed they were performing God's work. They were convinced that slaying Muslims was righteous, that plunder was justified, and that any atrocity was permissible if it furthered the Crusades' objectives. You likely do not share this perspective. You would be disturbed by actions taken in the name of faith, yet you would be unable to voice your dissent. To question the crusade was to invite accusations of heresy. You would be compelled to go along with it, lest you be branded a traitor or a coward. The absence of modern amenities would be maddening. Imagine a world without phones, the internet, electricity, running water, proper sanitation, showers, coffee, chocolate, sugar, painkillers, antibiotics, or any form of modern medical care. You would be living in conditions that would seem utterly unbearable. The sheer boredom would be relentless. Life in the Middle Ages moved at a glacial pace. There was extensive waiting, prolonged marches, and long periods spent in camp with virtually nothing to occupy your time. With no books, no forms of entertainment, and no diversions, you would face endless hours of tedium, punctuated only by moments of sheer terror. The constant uncertainty would be maddening. You would never truly know what was transpiring. There would be no news from home, no updates on the Crusades' progress, and no indication of when, or even if, you would ever return. You would exist in a perpetual state of apprehension, never knowing whether the next day would bring a battle, an outbreak of disease, or merely another day of monotonous marching. The lack of control would be profoundly frustrating. You would have no influence over events. You would simply follow orders, travel to wherever you were directed, and fight when commanded. Your existence would be entirely dictated by leaders who might be incompetent, corrupt, or even insane. You would be a mere pawn in someone else's game, devoid of agency, autonomy, or any control over your own destiny. And finally, the sheer pointlessness would be demoralizing. Even if you somehow survived all these trials, even if you managed to reach Jerusalem, you would eventually realize that the entire crusade was in vain, that the promises made were empty, and that your suffering had been for nothing. That stark realization, that overwhelming sense of futility, would shatter any remaining spirit you possessed. Therefore, no, you would not survive the Crusades. In reality, very few truly did. Even those who returned home alive were fundamentally altered, broken, and traumatized. The Crusades inflicted destruction upon individuals physically, mentally, emotionally, and economically. And this is the often untold truth about the Crusades. They were not glorious expeditions or noble quests. Rather, they were brutal, wretched campaigns that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people and achieved virtually nothing of lasting merit. So there you have it. The Crusades in all their brutal, miserable, and ultimately pointless glory. 2 centuries of warfare that accomplished little more than death, suffering, and the enduring animosity between Christians and Muslims. For a medieval peasant or knight, pledging oneself to the cross might have seemed like a sensible decision. You were promised salvation, adventure, and glory. What you actually received was starvation, disease, and profound trauma. The Crusades were presented as a holy mission, but they were, in essence, wars of conquest cloaked in religious rhetoric. They were fueled by political ambition, economic avarice, and religious fanaticism. And it was the common Crusaders, the men who believed the promises and ultimately paid the price, who suffered the most. Today, we reflect on the Crusades and perceive them for what they truly were. A tragic misjudgment, a dark period in human history, and a stark warning about the consequences when religious zeal supersedes reason and compassion. The Crusades did not safeguard Christianity, nor did they reclaim the Holy Land. They failed to achieve any of their stated objectives. What they did accomplish was the death of hundreds of thousands, the devastation of countless communities, and the creation of centuries of bitterness and conflict. And if you had been there, if you had taken up the cross and marched toward Jerusalem, you would not have survived. The journey itself would have claimed you, or the battles, the diseases, the extreme heat, or the overwhelming despair. The Crusades were, quite literally, hell on earth, and that is precisely why you would never have survived them. Thank you for watching. Until the next occasion, rest.